I'm Olivia Solon, and I'm editor of Tech Investigations for NBC News, based in San Francisco. And I'm here with investigative reporter Cyrus Farivar. And we're going to be talking about a story that we've been working on for quite a while about Facebook, and try to answer any questions that you have about it. The story is titled, "Mark Zuckerberg Leveraged Facebook User Data to Fight Rivals and Help Friends, Leaked Documents Show." And you can read this story. It's linked from the description in this Facebook Live. But in brief, for this investigation, we got hold of about 4,000 leaked pages of internal documents. And these included emails, chat logs, presentations, all coming from the company, spanning a time period of between around 2011 to 2015. Now, this was an absolutely critical time for the company, as it was discussing different ways to make money and control the competition. The documents appear to stem from a very messy lawsuit between a tiny little startup called 643 that made a somewhat creepy app that let you find people wearing bikinis in photos on Facebook, and obviously Facebook. So what do the documents show? I think the kind of main takeaway that I have from these documents is they show a real difference in the way Facebook talked internally about trading and restricting access to user data, and the way it talked to the public. So behind closed doors, user data was treated as a bargaining chip to reward partners and to punish competitors. But in public, Facebook was talking a lot about privacy and how it was controlling this data so that people's data was protected and kept private. But we find just very little mention of privacy in any of these emails. The only time it seems to come up is when they're talking about how to promote these changes like in public relations messages.
Yeah, and you know, this story, you know, we've been working on it for a couple months now, and it really, I think, sheds, some new light on the internal culture of the company at Facebook. You know, Facebook has claimed that it was merely, spitballing and just kind of blue skying ideas, when it was having these internal discussions about how it might sell access to user data. It came really close, actually. Mark Zuckerberg himself was discussing this. Other high-level executives were discussing this. They ultimately decided not to do that, but they came real close to doing that. And as Olivia mentioned, privacy was really not touched on in any meaningful way as far as we could discern. These documents show through emails, through chat logs, through slideshow slides, PowerPoint slides, that not only were these being discussed at the highest levels of, the executive level, but also to the board of directors, right? So truly all levels of the company at the decision-making tier were fully briefed as to kind of what was going on. And these documents interestingly show that this was not unanimously accepted within the company. We have some messages that describe these kinds of horse trading as unethical. There was one fun comparison to Casterly Rock. So if you're not a Game of Thrones fan like me, I had to be explained all of this. That's the ancestral home of the Lannisters. Is that what it is? Okay, the Lannisters. Which I'm being told is the most Machiavellian family in the Game of Thrones universe. So that's essentially at a high level what these documents show and what our story reports. There's also a separate story that is really a look at the company of 643, how it got founded. Its founder, Ted Kramer, who lives here in San Francisco, who we've met multiple times. So we're grateful to be able to share these stories with you. So we're happy to take any questions if there are any, so that's what we're doing.
So the question we're going to answer first is, what type of user data was used for leverage? And I think it's fair to say that the main data that was seen as really valuable to third-party developers was friends data. So a person on Facebook, not only their list of friends, but also information about the friends. It's the kind of data that Cambridge Analytica eventually got hold of. But this could be like photos posted by friends, updates posted by friends. And at that time, Facebook was allowing was allowing third parties to get access to that data pretty initially, like they gave it as a free-for-all, and then suddenly they realized that this was the main thing that third-party apps wanted, and so they decided to pick and choose winners to control who got access to that data.
And if you think about it, that's a really actually powerful tool, right? Imagine if if I handed Olivia my iPhone and said, okay, here's everybody in my contact list on my iPhone, go, access the data of the 100 people or whatever, on my phone. That's an incredibly powerful thing that a company like Facebook had. That, as you said, that's what enabled Cambridge Analytica. It's what enabled 643 to do what it did, which was to search friends' photos to get specifically at bikini photos, which is what they were trying to do. So the question was, how did we get the documents and how did we verify them? I think that's a great question. We got the documents, as we say in the story. They were shared with us by a well-known investigative reporter named Duncan Campbell, who's based in the UK. And he has done lots of investigative reporting on many other topics for a long time. He's involved in Panama Papers and many other journalistic projects. We were looking at Ted Kramer and 643 and this case on our own. We had been exchanging messages with him, met with him, and then during the process of our reporting, we were connected with Duncan Campbell, and he said, "Oh, by the way, I have this massive cache of documents. Would you like, to be included in this team of reporters in the UK, in Germany, and here in the US?" And we said, yes, we would. And so we were, provided access to the documents. We verified them by going through and checking with some of the documents that we have access to were previously shared by a British MP called Damian Collins, who for more than a year, maybe 2 years now, has been investigating Facebook in the UK. And has previously released hundreds of pages, and we could see clearly that those matched verbatim from what he had already released. So we knew that at least those were authentic. We also then went to Facebook directly and we said, we have these things and we want to quote from these specific parts, and we would love to hear your response to them. And at no time during our correspondence with Facebook and our communications with them did they say, oh my goodness, these documents are fake, they're inauthentic. At no time did they present any inkling that they were false or incorrect in some way. They are unhappy, I should say, that we have them, obviously, and that other reporters have had them, and they have moved in the ongoing 643 lawsuit that's happening just one county to the south of where we are right now in San Mateo County, California. They have moved to depose Mr. Kramer and his business partner, Thomas Scaramellino, to ask them questions as to whether they themselves were part of the leak. And just earlier this week, I believe on Monday, they filed sworn statements saying that they were not the leakers. So yeah.
So the question is, what are some of the companies that received Facebook user data? Pretty much all.
A lot of
every company that was working with Facebook at that time would have received some kind of Facebook user data if they were working with Facebook's sort of platform product, which was just a way for third-party apps to kind of interact with the Facebook platform through either wanting to access the friends who when you signed up to a new app. It could be a dating app like Tinder. You want to see which other people are using the app. That was enabled by this whole system. So Tinder's one of them. There were a few messaging apps like Message Me, but that was eventually had the data restricted because it was seen as a competitor. Amazon got access to some of this data. 643, this bikini spotting app, was able to get access to people's photos. The quiz app that eventually passed on data to Cambridge Analytica was among them. So I mean, there was thousands of apps that got access to this data, and Facebook decided to start locking that down in 2014, 2015.
Yeah, and this is the entire heart of what 643's lawsuit is about. Is they say, look, this is anti-competitive, and when Facebook changed the terms of what it calls the Graph API, this is this data access that we're talking about. When they moved from an earlier version that was much more permissive to a later version 2.0 and 2.1, and now they're on something further, that was one of the major changes that they made, which was to make access to the Graph API more restrictive, which apps like 643, the Bikini's app, and many others did not like. And 643, instead of just kind of grumbling silently, took the extra step of filing a lawsuit that has now dragged on for more than 4 years.
Is there any way to keep information or data that you share with Facebook private? I mean, what do you mean by private? Who are you trying to keep it from? From Facebook or from third parties?
I think that's a really interesting question, which is, to me, it says a lot about how we think about wanting to use services like Facebook. I think we all want to keep in touch with our friends and family, particularly if we have friends and family that live, far away, that we don't get to see a lot. I often say, we like cat videos too much. We like cute, fun things on the internet, but we also don't like, at the same level, our data being shared in maybe ways that we didn't authorize or didn't intend or didn't anticipate. And I think many of us, including us sitting here right now, I think are starting to reflect in new ways as to how Facebook in particular, but companies in the Valley more broadly, are using this kind of data. So I would say it seems to me downright impossible, as far as I know, to be able to use Facebook, but also at the same time withhold information from Facebook. There are some tiny exceptions to that. I'm thinking of like your account password, for example. I would hope is hashed and cryptographically secure in a way that Facebook itself doesn't know that. But insofar as like your activity that you do, messages that you exchange, I sort of assume that Facebook has access to all of that.
There is one thing. Facebook has definitely improved its privacy settings since all of this happened, and particularly since Cambridge Analytica, the whole scandal broke last year. They've definitely clamped down on things, and they've done things like created a setting that allows you to completely cut off the sharing of data with any third parties. I think it's called like platform privacy, but they only introduced that very recently after a lot of outrage over some privacy lapses in the past.
I mean, I would say I think it's clear that they're trying, but I feel like it's one of those things where, it's almost like a Sisyphean tale where you take one step forward and two steps back, that there's always going to be some new kind of threat. But fundamentally, I think the issue is that Facebook and other large tech companies like it are predicated on the idea that user data is, right, there's this kind of old saying that many people watching this may be familiar with, right, that if you're not paying for the product, you are the product, right? And so that's something I think that many people kind of have intuited, and I've seen people bring this up on Twitter, over the last 24 hours saying, of course this was well known, of course they were doing this, but I think like when you see it in black and white in these terms, and you can see in these emails, that we've quoted from, there was one message where an employee was referring to Zuckerberg himself as a, quote, master of leverage, which I think is a great way to think about this. I think it really raises questions about how companies like Facebook can use this data to act in maybe an anti-competitive way. And this, again, goes back to the core of what the 643 legal case is about, is they say, look, there were other companies that were provided opportunities to extend their access to this older API, companies like the Royal Bank of Canada and Nissan and other companies. We were not provided that same thing. We want a level playing field, which is what 643 says Facebook promised them. And so, I think it's really hopefully making regulators, lawmakers, policymakers, think about how this industry kind of should operate.
So the question is, what can the average person do to protect themselves and protect their data, whether people should continue to use Facebook or not? I mean, I think that's a personal decision. If you feel like you're getting a lot of value out of it and you don't mind the company mining your life and your data in order to fund itself, then continue to use it. I think you can also use it in a way where you share less information about yourself. And I think we should also add that, although we're talking about Facebook here, and Facebook has become the sort of, I don't know, do you say bogeyman or boogerman?
We would say boogeyman in this country.
Boogeyman, yeah. There are a lot of companies that are collecting a lot of personal data. Google is, there are a lot of ad tracking companies, and it can be really difficult to know what to do to restrict it, and sometimes you just end up throwing your hands up and feeling completely helpless about the whole thing. But in general, there are things there are things that you can use to stop advertising tracking technology. There are ways that you can interact with social networks so you don't upload as much personal information about yourself. But it has to be a trade-off. It always has to be a trade-off between sort of the user experience, the value that you're getting out from the utility that the service provides versus the data that you're giving to them.
Yeah, and I would agree with everything Olivia just said, and I would also say that there are new laws that are being debated as we speak here in California, but also in Washington State and other parts of the U.S. and abroad as well. I think lawmakers are starting to figure out how they might enable some new restrictions that would maybe change the way these companies can operate.
Yeah, I think one of the key things about the regulation is it's able to sort of prevent this sort of sharing of data between companies, which is actually where most of the most egregious stuff happens, is when Facebook buys third-party data from some data broker and puts them together and then learns new things about you, about your health, about your purchasing habits, and then uses that to retarget you with advertising. I think that's the kind of place where you can't really go to any individual company to complain. You need to go to the regulators. So I guess, that leads us to the ultimate point of speak to your lawmakers and demand better privacy legislation.
Yeah, and I would just say one last thing. Facebook has always said that the service is free, and they do that so that everybody can access it, which is great. But I think it's within Facebook's power to offer a more privacy-focused product that people would pay for. And I think there are many people out there, many Facebook users out there that would consider paying $20, $30, $50, maybe $100 a year or something to use Facebook, knowing that their data might be not shared or maybe not shared at all in the same way that it is now, right? I think companies like Apple, it's obviously a very different company, but I think it's been shown that people are willing to pay for privacy services, and also that people do get a lot of utility out of Facebook. For now, Facebook has not offered that yet. Sure.
Yeah, so the question was, what is 643? Yeah, and that's just to quickly flag, that's the company. The reason why we got these documents is that they were leaked from they stem from a lawsuit. They weren't leaked by the company itself, but that we have these documents because there's a big lawsuit, and the documents were submitted to the court as part of discovery. But Cyrus, you can explain.
Yeah, so 643, yeah, as was mentioned, is the company that sort of kicked off this entire saga. They were this very short-lived company. Their CEO is a guy named Ted Kramer, who lives here in San Francisco. 643 made an app called Pikinis, Pikinis, and it did exactly what it sounds like. It was designed to look through Facebook friends' photos of particularly women in bikinis. There's actually a YouTube ad that was made in 2013 that sort of imagines a scene where there's a guy at a bar, he goes and orders a drink, and he looks at women sitting in the bar who are dressed normally, and whips out his phone, presumably using the Bikinis app, and then magically they're sort of transformed into wearing bikinis. Interestingly enough, if you go and find this video, and we'll post a link later, Ted Kramer himself acts as the bartender in this video, which I think is really funny. But so this lawsuit, is over this very tiny company that really not many people had even heard of or even used this app. In one of the court documents, 643, the company, raked in something like $400 in app sales when their free Facebook app. What did I say?
You said raked in as if it was like this huge bounty.
Yeah. Raked in $400. So this was a very tiny company. It didn't last very long. They folded pretty much after this happened. But once they felt really aggrieved, and Ted Kramer, the CEO, felt really aggrieved and felt like he wasn't given a fair shake. to compete against these other companies. And that's really what this lawsuit is all about.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add to that. I mean, clearly it has, 643 have this creepy app. I don't think anyone is feeling particularly sympathetic towards their business model in general. And I think Facebook has very successfully painted this whole case as being about trying to clamp down on quote unquote like sketchy apps like 643 and like the app that eventually fed data to Cambridge Analytica. But the lawsuit isn't actually about that. The lawsuit is about whether or not developers in general were misled by Facebook in terms of whether or not they'd continue to have access to this data that many of them relied on for their business. So even though we have this like terrible plaintiff on one side, I think they have a really legitimate argument of potentially to argue that Facebook was behaving unfairly to some and giving preferential treatment to others.
Right. And just as a final epilogue to this, one of my favorite details in this story is that the name of the company 643, for baseball fans like me, refers, of course, to a 643 double play. And Ted Kramer had a very short-lived career as a baseball player, professional baseball player in Germany, which is one of my favorite details from this story.
Great.
Yeah, so thank you again for watching with us. Thanks for reading along. As always, we welcome tips and suggestions for stories and companies or issues that we should look into. We're based here in San Francisco. You can email us. You can find us on Twitter, etc. We're pretty easy to find.
Probably don't send it via Facebook.
Probably don't send it via Facebook. But we're easy to find. Our phone numbers and email addresses are very easy to find. But we sincerely do really want people to send us tips and suggestions, and we will read them and consider them. And thank you for your time and interest.
Thank you very much.